Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Connections Conference. This session is entitled Educational Psychology and Wargaming, and we have two panelists.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome
back to the Connections Conference.
Sorry,
this session is entitled Educational.
I'm sorry about that. So Kate Keene is the Director of Institutional Research, Assessment, and Planning at the Marine Corps University. In addition to managing the university's institutional effectiveness process, she supports the evaluation of all professional military education programs and directorates. Kate has spent 11 years working on evaluation and assessment of military education programs, providing advice on the design of learning assessments at the classroom, program, and institutional level. She is a member of the Military Education Assessment Advisory Group and has frequently served on military accreditation teams. Her research focuses on assessment and performance evaluation in complex contexts, currently focused on team-based simulation learning environments. Kate has an MA from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and a BA from the College of William & Mary. She's currently finishing coursework in a PhD in education research methodology at George Mason University. Also on the panel is Tony Arciero. He's an education research analyst at Marine Corps University and an adjunct professor at George Mason University. He received his doctorate in educational psychology and research methodology at George Mason University. His research area is in life purpose as an asset for adolescents and emerging adults facing challenging life transitions. In his role as Marine Corps University, he contributes to a program of continuous improvement at both the classroom and institution levels. As an adjunct professor and graduate lecturer, he has taught graduate courses in learning theory, motivation, human development, and quantitative methods, and an undergraduate course in communication. Tony spent 22 years on active duty in the Air Force as a space and missile operator. He received a BS in occupational education from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale and an MS in college student personnel administration from Central Missouri State University. Kate and Tony, welcome both, and I hand the panel over to you.
Okay, next slide. Welcome, everyone. Here's our agenda. We're going to take a look at how educational psychology can inform using war games as an educational tool with a focus on assessment. We're going to look at two lenses of how educational psychology can support learning using war games, and there are many others. We'll focus on two. And as I mentioned, we'll have a heavy emphasis on assessment throughout the discussion today. Next slide. So, overall question, does wargaming improve learning? A hint, yes, it does. We believe it does, and we'll try to convince you of that while we're here today. A recent article from Wong and Heath suggested that maybe educational psychology and some other fields can add to how wargaming impacts the learning process. And so we'd like to offer our perspectives from the educational psychology discipline. Next.
So in addition to looking at learning and wargaming, we've also seen an expansion on the demand for wargaming within professional military education in particular. In the guidance documents we saw in the previous slide. And at the same time, an increased emphasis on assessment and improving assessment of learning within those contexts. So that's also part of the reason why we're focusing in on assessment here today, as we look at how and whether learning is achieved in war games. Now, assessment is essentially about constructing an argument, the idea of taking evidence, making claims, and then using those evidence and the claims that you're making in order to inform some decision or action, whether it's the student's action to take different steps to prepare for their next learning event, or whether it's the decision of a faculty member to go back and revise some of the ways that they've been teaching or to reinforce certain learning elements in order to be able to better enable, those students to succeed as they go forward in the class and as they leave to go back to their next place of duty. And, to some extent, the process that we're talking about is kind of an innate part of the decision-making process. But there's a challenge within the wargaming context to try and balance game design, pedagogy, or your instructional design and your assessment design, and align all of those functions together to really have a fluid event that is, progresses through each of your steps and identifies each of your evidence. And so the question this model that we're showing tries to answer is, how do we do this? This is one model adapted from evidence-centered design, which many of you may have seen. And this method essentially is how we conceptualize key elements of assessment design within the context of any activity. So we're looking first at that domain analysis. What does a student need to know or do or demonstrate in a particular context? And in a game context, in what environment do they need to demonstrate this knowledge or this learning or action that they're able to do? And the second step of that domain model, we talk about how do we know if students have achieved the learning that we think they have, and what is it we're trying to get them to demonstrate. So at a basic level, we're articulating, if I see X from a student, then Y. So if a student successfully completes this task or produces an excellent product at the end of this game or solves the puzzle, then they are what? They have mastered this knowledge. They are ready for the profession. That's the type of claim that we make with our assessment approach. And as we move to that third step, it's really about how do we gather and then interpret the information that we're talking about in the domain model to really seamlessly look at how do we gather evidence. So selecting tools that are not disruptive to our process, timing them so that it does not disrupt and so that it actually occurs when that behavior is observable, and ultimately having a plan in mind for how we integrate that into our decision making at the end of that course of action.
Okay, so just for an overview and very closely related to what Kate just said, educational psychology is the broad study of how people learn. So looking at the problems and the processes and the products of education. But very similar to what Kate talked about in terms of assessment, EdPsych looks at the learning process in several different ways. But one way is to look at the outcome or the objective if you're planning a learning activity. What are you looking for? What are you hoping to achieve? And then breaking that a little bit down a little further, what are those behaviors? What does it look like when someone has mastered a subject? Or we are looking for opportunities to observe that behavior, observe that learning. Now, all good instructors do this, and you do it as a normal part of your planning for lessons, right, for teaching. And I want to emphasize that I think war games can be looked at in that light as any other educational tool that will incorporate into our lessons to achieve our learning objectives similarly, right? We'll think hard about where to put them so that they're achieving those outcomes. Students are being given the opportunity to demonstrate those behaviors. We'll be planning for when we'll look for those observations of when and where the behavior occurs, and then we'll interpret what we see. We'll measure, and we'll decide, typically using a theoretical lens, even if it's not explicit, of what we're seeing. And is that mastery, or is that someone who needs a little bit more work? So let's go on to the next one. All right, throughout the presentation, we're going to ask you to take a few minutes and, or take, in this case, 30 seconds, and participate. We'll be doing this a few different times. So if you would, for the first one, write down top 3 learning outcomes that you look for in your educational war games. What are you trying to achieve? If you're willing to share, please share them with us. But we'll build on these throughout the presentation. So take the next 30 seconds and jot down a few ideas. And the first one we have is understanding why decisions were made. That's a really good one, right? Because it's difficult to do. You might, even if you observe an external behavior, understanding the why behind it is a little bit tougher. And that's a real assessment challenge. So that's good. Let's keep with that, and we'll come back to it on the next interaction where you have a chance to dig into it a little bit deeper. All right, Kate.
All right, and we had a question earlier about, by learning assessment, do we mean student fulfillment of learning outcomes or some sort of relation to course or professional fulfillment? And I think part of our later presentation will start to address this question, but essentially that wargaming can fulfill multiple different functions within the educational environment, and that can be student fulfillment of learning outcomes. But it can also be used in aggregate to look at a course's performance. If student learning has not been achieved, or if there are gaps in student learning that you see across a cohort, you can observe that within a war game and adjust your course teaching in the future, or even just after observing that in a war game, in order to promote their eventual mastery of those outcomes at the end. And we can revisit that if that question wasn't fully answered at this time. So as we think about wargaming purposes, in the literature about wargaming, we really see three purposes that are largely highlighted or predominantly highlighted in that literature. We see wargaming used analytically as a tool to look at the quality of decisions, or even to look at the likelihood of an action-reaction set. We have educational purposes of wargaming that are targeting particular learning outcomes, things that we want students to know, be able to do, or to value even. And we see an experiential quality to wargaming, something that you see here embodied in another educational psychology theory promoted by Kolb, which is an experiential learning cycle, where you see that sort of situated or embedded experience in that wargaming environment creates a new sense of shared experience with their colleagues within that particular game, and then has a common source of content or knowledge that's been created that can be used for further discussion and reflection. And as you look at that theory that Kolb would bring in, you have this cycle of experience, reflection, conceptualization, and experimentation that's iterative, and we see that replicated in the iterative property of most of the war games that we play, or within broader curriculums across multiple war games that can have scaffolded or growing and increasingly complex contexts or learning outcomes. And as we see these three different purposes, we shouldn't assume that they are mutually exclusive, but that perhaps we can have some primary and secondary, even tertiary purposes of the game, and that this might shape the types of learning outcomes that we're looking for, or even shape the type of game that we're going to incorporate into our environment. And within game design, we can also see that there are a variety of games and game designs that fit within the context of wargaming. As we think about it, there are really many possibilities of different types of outcomes that we could be looking at in a wargaming scenario. And so there are many opportunities for assessment. At the same time, there are many different functions that the game can play within the broader curriculum. So we could see the game as a source of content, which you might assess by having some sort of pre-post test to look at particular knowledge gain. You may be using it to promote learning or to look at learning application, in which case you might look at the quality of understanding based on a rubric that assesses a particular product at the end of that game. Or you might look at it more as a situational or as an embedded learning activity, in which case you're going to focus on some reinforcement through reflection and some targeted after action or reflection questions. And here on the right is one of these graphics that has really helped to spell out for me some of those variations in how there's an interaction between the types of outcomes that you might expect to be able to observe in a game and the types of games that you might choose to play. And this one was from the UK Ministry of Defence Red Teaming Guide.
Okay, another activity. What we'd like to do now, if you would take those three activities or the learning outcomes that you jotted down earlier, if you'd pick one of those, and let's dig down into it a little bit. Write down several ways. We'd like to see if you can get 3 different ways that a student might demonstrate that behavior, that outcome, within a war game environment. And we had a challenging one on that first part about understanding why decisions were made. So this is an opportunity to think a little deeper and see if there's any kind of, what would be the indications of something like that? Where's that, what would tell you why a decision was made, or something maybe not quite so obvious? That's why it was a pretty tough assessment challenge, but see if you can come up with a few to demonstrate behavior you're looking for, the learning outcome. And if you're willing to share, that'd be great too. We'd love to see what you're thinking.
And even as we build on that example about decisions being made, you might start with your assessment process by looking more specifically at where there's evidence of decision making that you could use and pull forward into some sort of after action discussion in order to look at that evidence and evaluate those decisions.
And that's a great one, right? Explain the process and information and assumptions used. So there you're asking the participant in stride, likely, right, to take a moment to just verbalize what they've done. And that's a way to get behavior out there, right? Something that might be hidden from view, and you could ask them to make it visible. Very good.
And some really important subcomponents of that statement that just went up in the chat, right? There are 3 key components that they're looking for here. Something about process, something about information and how information was selected, probably evaluated, and the assumptions or framework that was brought to bear during that process and or applied to that information. So 3 criteria that came out also in that statement there.
And we're going to be hitting very close to that in the next discussion. So we could move forward. So just like we talked about, identifying behaviors, right? And I'd like to use the example of critical thinking because we're often trying to encourage and develop critical thinking skills. And some people say, hey, we can't measure critical thinking. And I would argue you might be right? So wait a minute, we just said we'd like to measure it, right? We'd like to advance it. How do we do that? Well, I think our first step would be to decompose that larger task into its elements. So here we have a list of some of the elements of critical thinking. And they look familiar because we just mentioned them in the previous slide about processes and assumptions and information, right? So as you think about that, hey, I'd like to study or help a student learn about critical thinking using this war game, maybe the goal should be something along the lines of, I'd like to ensure a student can value and figure out how to check the credibility of their sources as one component of critical thinking, right? So as an example, let's say in the game, player gets some intelligence, and that helps to support a decision. It might be exactly what they were hoping for, and exactly what they had planned on, the right intelligence, but did they double check it? Was the source reliable? Or could a confirmation bias challenge been in there, right? That they got what they're expecting and they went for it and it was actually a decoy or a deception. So that's a great way to go after this idea of checking sources, which isn't directly critical thinking, but it's a component of it, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about. And that's all this should be prepared for in the planning stage. As you're thinking about which game, a game that brings out a need to check sources, and where in that game a decision would be made, and where would that opportunity for checking the sources be. That would be the instructor planning it, being ready to observe that behavior, and perhaps, as you mentioned earlier, asking to verbalize, right? Did you check the source? How did you make that decision, and looking for the particular type of answer. So moving over to the right side, I don't want everybody to run away just because it looks like, oh no, here we are going to talk about theory. I just want to point out that a theory is just somebody's perception of how the world works. And if it helps you think through a problem, then it's a good, useful theory. If not, don't worry about it. If you go into the next slide, Kate. If you see down at the bottom there, those couple of boxes together could constitute a theory, right? They show a relationship and could help you think through, for example, that earlier question we had, right? Do war games support learning? Well, if that set of relationships is correct, that war games affect motivation, and motivation can affect learning, well then yeah, right? That answers the question, right? War games could affect learning. So that's kind of a visual of how theories might help us think through a question. So let's go on to the next. So just a little bit about motivation. I study motivation, and so the simplest way to think about it is it's the reason we act, the why behind our actions. A little more complex look at it is it's goals in a particular context. And Ford argues that we all have goals, and let's say in a learning environment, what's our goal in that context? And so how we think about that will certainly affect how we react. For example, or a student who is totally disengaged, do they have a learning goal in that environment, or do they have a goal to maybe not look like they don't know what's going on? So I'm not talking about life goals, or long-term goals, or even medium-term goals here. What I've keyed in on, especially in the wargaming environment, but I think throughout educational processes, are what I call micro goals. So as an example, let's say you're a musician and you're working through scales, right? So you can go through those scale in literally seconds, right? Maybe 30 seconds, right? But as you do it, you're focusing on what you're doing and you're trying to do it well. And perhaps you have a goal to get through it quickly, or to try a different speed of notes, and you go through and you make a mistake. Well, it's you turn that into a micro goal. I want to go through it again without making that mistake. And you have the opportunity to go quickly and get immediate feedback of how did I do? What can I do to improve? Let's try it again. And it's that kind of micro goal and focus on what you're doing and continuous improvement that has a real power to help us learn and grow. So I think goals have a lot to do with learning. And I think war games provide a great environment where the learner can have, if appropriately coached, can have these micro goals to continuously improve. And if we do this goal, focus on what you're doing, and then reflection back to resetting new goals, we have a cycle. And in the next slide, let's see what that looks like. And that's called self-regulated learning. And this has been shown to be a really powerful way to think about learning. And if we can encourage this cycle, this sort of gives ownership of the learning to the student. So if we help them establish goals and set strategies and plan for what they're doing in the learning environment, and help them, coach them to focus on what they're doing and evaluate how it's going while they're in the middle of the activity, and then give them an opportunity afterwards to reflect on that. How did it go? Why did it go well? What could be improved? Sometimes that reflection should be guided. Sometimes it comes from the student. And then that reflection can feed directly back into the next opportunity to learn. Again, this process, if done well, this allows the instructor to move more into the position of being a guide and a coach, and it provides the student the opportunity to take ownership of their learning. And again, if the focus going through this cycle is on micro goals, that every time you go around that cycle, it's seeking to improve very, very small increments, then the feedback that you get is almost always positive, right? And even if it's negative, like, oh, I didn't play that note correctly, it's not an overwhelmingly negative, right? It's just a small thing that, oh, I could work on it. And that's where the instructor's feedback can help, saying, yep, you've done that really well. We can work on this one little thing and try it again. And so that positive feedback as you pursue goals, even tiny goals like these micro goals, returns a motivating force, both emotionally and cognitively, and allows the motivation to grow. And as I said earlier, that there's a good deal of research that says that increased motivation supports increased learning. And if I can, just real briefly, one of the things, there's a real complex relationship there. I just showed motivation to learning, but there's more to it, right? So higher motivation can lead to immersion and greater engagement in the material, and we see that in the wargaming environment. In fact, it's I think one of the real values of using war games as educational tools is people get deeply into the situation, right? They get into character, they get into the scenario, and that sort of enhances the whole experience. And so now you've got motivation and engagement, which again could really enhance the learning process. So, okay.
All right, so let's change the perspective a little bit, but we'll notice that there are some similarities and even valuable overlaps between some motivation theory and the lens that I'm going to use to talk about learning in wargaming, which is called expert performance theory. And what this theory provides us is another perspective of how learning occurs within an activity. And then from that, we deduce different ways to actually identify what we would want to assess within that game in order to promote future learning, or where we would actually examine that learning occurring, or that learning having been completed. So within expert performance theory, it's largely used in things like music, places where we have a lot of reproducible repeat performances, particularly in high stakes settings. And we can start to see here, as I describe that, why that might be valuable in a professional military education setting, where we have folks like Colonel Tino Perez publishing on performance as learning in PME on things like War on the Rocks, or an emphasis on project-based learning, or on authentic learning, where folks are actually performing duties or fulfilling tasks that'll be similar to those that they'll have when they return to the field. And so we can see within expert performance theory, reproducible high-quality performance is the target for this particular approach. That's what they're seeking to do. And so when they look to develop learning activities, or when they look to target assessment, they begin by looking at the actual end performance. And they say, what does expert performance look like? How do those who have reproducible, high-quality performance actually achieve that? How do they prepare for their performance? And also, what are underlying mechanisms that enable it? And ultimately, they use that process of identifying these underlying mechanisms to look at different ways to develop expertise, breaking it down to its smallest parts, which has some consistency with this micro goal component that Tony mentioned earlier. So as you're looking at it, if we extend this music as an example here, scales are a small component of an underlying mechanism that a musician needs to be able to master in order to quickly and adaptively respond to new musical requirements as they're performing. But it's only one. There are other components that they might need to study, such as music theory, that would help them predict and actually recognize patterns as they're playing new music. There's playing, in an ensemble if they're going to be having accompaniment or playing in a group, in order to recognize and actually learn how to adapt their tempo or to adapt their interactions with their teammates within that setting. And so those are just three mechanisms that we can look at and think about within that context. And several of them have some real parallels to the wargaming environment, particularly if you're looking at things like team decision-making, where you may focus in on team decision-making processes and break that down one step further to what are their communication processes. Break that down one step further, you could actually look at other elements of team dynamics within that environment as well. And that's not to say that within a war game, you're going to necessarily break down and focus on just one element within a game, although you could pick a game that focuses in on a particular skill, like scales, a tactical level skill that needs to be reinforced, and build up, with that combination of different focused skills to a more complex activity. But it also means that you could focus your assessment progressively more complex or on different components of those underlying mechanisms over time. And the benefit of the wargaming environment is the iteration in that process that gives you an opportunity to take turn one to focus on a particular underlying mechanism and places for improvement, and turn two to focus on another. And as you're looking at a curriculum as a whole, you could even do that at a game level and reinforce those different components across multiple games. So within this theory, as you can see here on the slide, there are some really key components as you think about it in terms of deliberate practice, which means, and we hear this in the Marine Corps environment about reps and sets, but we want to do those reps and sets with proper form. And that's enabled by immediate feedback and feedback that's focused on a particular process.
Before you go on, Kate, we had a really good input from Matthew about learning objective being develop the ability to make effective decisions faster. And then another comment on that is faster moves as the game progresses. So I'm guessing that, Matt, what you're saying, Matthew, what you're saying is that, if the objective is to develop the ability to make effective decisions faster, and the way you're getting at it is make those game moves quicker as the game progresses, which is really interesting way to do it, right? So now you're designing the pace of the game to get at your learning objective. Really interesting. I like it. Also, Anne brought up the point about providing a rubric, and do we think it's, if we provide the participants a rubric prior to the game, would it help or hinder? I'm not sure what you think. I throw out my idea. I love rubrics, and I've always used them, and I tried to go work through them with the students before the activity. So there's number one, no surprises, and you have a clear objective. You know what success looks like. And it also supports good feedback, right? So I can use that rubric seeing how the student had exposure to it in pointing out effective, clear, and focused feedback. So pointing out a specific thing that you could try differently going forward. And your thoughts, Kate?
Yeah, so as a general rule, I never like to say always, right? As a general rule, I think sharing a rubric has a lot of advantages and some particular advantages in a wargaming context. The first of which being one of the challenges of learning in war games is when they start to fight the game or focus more on game rules or working around game rules than focusing on the learning outcomes and objectives. And in some cases, having a clear idea of how you're going to be evaluated is a way to bring you back to those outcomes and to focus on what's truly important. The benefit of rubrics is that it establishes some clear rules for the conversation that happens between the faculty member and the students. And there's also some fairness aspects to sharing that information so that there's that clarity of how am I going to be evaluated? What are the stakes of this activity? Now, you're going to have to design your rubric in a way that doesn't, as some folks, are concerned, give away the answers in a way that's going to shape your activity to the point that it becomes, non-predictable. So you wouldn't say, must be creative to the point that comes up with a brand new idea and then expect that, there's going to be a lot of focus on that creativity to the, exclusion of all the other factors are actually playing the game. So there's some consideration in the design and the approach of and the level of detail that you share with the students. I think that's important there. And as we tie back to that previous comment and we think about it through the lens of expert performance theory, the idea of having faster responses or faster high quality decision making speaks very well to this theory. In the sense that as learning occurs or as you progress up to a more expert level, you're going to see and recognize patterns more effectively. You're going to be making decisions based more on intuition than perhaps on fixed rules, connecting back with prior knowledge that has been gathered through your experience. And so as you're thinking about that from an assessment perspective, as you start seeing this aspect of patterns and intuition, you may have less obvious observation points where you can see that decision-making discussed, or you can see students show their work on the math that they're doing in their heads. And so that's part of what you want to build into your assessment approach or adapt as you know that students are progressing up that spectrum so that you have a rubric that actually looks for information that you're actually going to see within that environment if you have more proficient or competent, based on that model, learners. Whereas novices, you might look for more baseline information and knowledge, target questions about specific rules, about considerations, and focus more on patterns or prior experience that's being brought in as you move up that spectrum.
Okay, so last activity, looking back on your outcome and the behaviors that we've done in the last two activities, take a look at that one behavior that we asked you to dive down into a little bit, or that one outcome, and see if you can write down 2 or 3 key distinctions between strong and weak performances. So here we're getting to, we've got an outcome, we're thinking about what does it look like, what should I be looking for, and now we want to go a little bit more nuanced and say, all right, what does it look like when it's done really well, and what does it look like when it's done not so well, or could use some help. And so, or if you like, you can free write a narrative description of an exceptional performance you observed in a war game if you don't have a specific outcome that you're working on. But the idea is to get to thinking through what you're going to see and how the war game and the war game environment is going to support both the student learning and your ability to assess and provide good feedback along that learning journey.
This is also a great check on the different components that you're going to decide to assess. If you notice that what you recognize about strong and weak performance is not reflected in your criteria, then there may be something else that you're targeting or seeking for students to accomplish in this activity that needs to be reflected within your assessment design. And having that consistency is really important as you go across to make sure that there's that alignment between your expectations and either the evaluation criteria or the different things that you're zooming in on as part of your questioning and reflection activities for that formative feedback.
Right. So just to wrap up, we've identified and discussed here two lenses through which we could think about educational psychology and how it supports the learning environment, and specifically in a war game kind of environment. Those are just two. There are many others, and we encourage you to think about those and see how they might work into your planning. We also focused on assessment because I believe that the war game environment allows an opportunity for a lot of formative assessment. And along with that assessment, excellent, high quality, high volume feedback, right? Both of which are integral to a great learning environment. So we can help shape students' behavior, and if we can help them establish very small goals and help them think about those goals, think about what they're doing, reflect on it, and go back and continue that cycle. And that self-regulatory process, again, gives the ownership of the learning process mostly to the student, where the instructor then becomes a guide and someone encouraging and coaching. And that can lead, if that cycle is done over and over again in the presence of a strong coach, to lead to expert performance. Right? We believe that many of these ideas are best worked through in the planning phase. Before you get into the classroom, before you're in a game, before you even think about which game you're going to use. You should plan it all out and see how it fits, how a war game might fit within the larger curriculum. Does it come after a reading or a group discussion or a case study, or before? How does it fit? And planning, where are those opportunities to observe and assess? Okay.
And I think the other thing and only thing I would add before we open back up for questions is that the benefit of theory is that we can come back from what we've decided is most important to assess and have that sort of quality check to say, okay, is there an element that I missed that if I'm going to promote and understand how learning occurred, whether and how learning occurred in this activity, that I should include in my assessment plan? Are there existing assessment tools that I can access and use within this type of environment to reinforce learning? And how can I chunk apart or target particular assessment approaches or assessment moments in order to best promote learning and have that outcome achieved? And I see here we have our first question. Ethics was a key topic. Rethink how you would act in an ethical manner. So ethics, yes, for sure. It's one of those latent variables that has many different definitions when you get to these operational definitions. So as we think about how do we measure or how do we assess ethics in war games, we might consider, as we go back to that ethics, expert performance approach, are there different levels of knowledge about ethics that we need to take into account within our games? So do we have different expectations of those who are coming fresh off and fresh into this type of issue that we need to be asking particular types of questions? There are also some particular tools that are already being used out there in terms of educational psychology to look at ethics Most of them will not have been used in a wargaming context, but they might have some really valuable insights into how they're constructing key components that should be used to provide feedback to students in terms of ethical performance. Tony, do you want to add something on this too?
Yeah, very closely related to what you're just talking about is I'd go back to that slide we had about critical thinking, and instead of going after critical thinking, we maybe think about decomposing that, right? What makes up, what does an ethical decision look like, and what are the contexts, and are there pieces and parts that are easier, as Kate talked about, the chunk, can we get at something smaller? Can we try that same decision, that ethical versus non-ethical kind of decision, in multiple contexts? So yeah, there's a lot there, and again, goes back to the planning process. How do we think about where does this fit into the curriculum? Are there, again, readings and group discussions prior to seeing it in a war game?
I think there's a whole strain of literature in educational psychology as well that looks at things like conceptual change. And as you think about ethics, that's one of those areas where people have internalized a lot of ethical precepts, things that guide their behavior that they may not have necessarily examined closely. And so there are some approaches in the conceptual change literature that might be beneficial in terms of how they actually get students to examine and re-examine some of these things that are taken as truths, or decisions that are seen as black and white as opposed to more nuanced. So there's some of that literature that would also be particularly relevant to that question.
Great, thanks, Tracy and Kate. So right now there's some folks typing, but there's no unanswered questions. So let me ask you, in the wargaming community, there's ongoing discussion about how to develop new wargamers and what it means to be a good wargamer. And should we develop academic programs and all for wargaming? So what type of advice or thoughts might you give the wargaming community in what to think and how to go about even developing an advancement rubric, if you will, on developing wargamers? I would say it's almost similar to developing a coursework, not just a class, but how to actually develop a whole program to develop war gamers.
Well, and it's interesting, within Marine Corps University, we have one, and I can't take responsibility for it, but they have a great idea going on at Command and Staff College where they have a Gray Scholars program that looks at wargaming. And there are some key components to that I think are starting to try and answer this question about how do we teach people to meaningfully design and implement and then refine war games within their community. And I think that from an assessment perspective, there's a lot of literature out there that could be incorporated into that type of a discipline to look at, making sure that we answer that question: how do we know that learning occurred in this activity? Why should we use this activity in order to promote learning? So not just using wargaming as a panacea, another reference to another article that's been out there about wargaming. So when to use it, why to use it, and how to determine whether it worked and how to improve it in the future. That assessment would need to be integrated into that. And that would include educational psychology as well as game-based learning literature from my perspective. Tony?
I would just add that one of the biggest assists I got in my early learning in this area was at Command and General Staff College. James Stetton and his team have a great, they have a curriculum on building and developing war gamers. And that would be the place I'd start. I'd call James.
Great, thank you. And also along those lines, I hear a lot of people talking about when they look back and do reviews of a war game, they ask people, do you feel you learned anything? And the person says yes, which is great. But could you give some perhaps advice or thoughts on what more we could add to did you learn anything, or how to capture something that we could possibly then create some more quantifiable learning scores or checks instead of just, did you learn something? Yeah, we feel we did.
And maybe I'll jump on that one first because I'm very passionate about the response to that. And I think what we tried to start communicating with this as we organized this presentation was that educational psychology has a useful approach to deliberately identifying and targeting learning before you start the gaming. And so in some cases, asking after the fact, did you learn anything, will only tell you so much. It will tell you whether the game was able to have some sort of learning occur. Whereas we can actually start from the beginning and intentionally think about what is the learning that we want to promote, what would be most appropriate to ensuring that happens. And as we identify that target in the beginning, we can purposefully integrate certain questions or checkpoints. We can adapt certain documentation that might naturally occur within a wargaming sequence. So, for example, if we wanted to see evidence about improved quality of decision-making, as students are turning in their plan, if they have some sort of action card or some sort of communication card that they're filling in and submitting, or if they're briefing the facilitator on their decisions, there's an opportunity there to have a quality check that either occurs after the fact, when the faculty member looks back at that documentation and sees whether across iterations, did I see better decision-making? What was the quality of decision-making overall? There's also an opportunity for, as one of our commenters mentioned, to have some strategic pause and questioning at that time to target particular learning outcomes. And the more that you can plan those in advance to say, if I haven't seen students discussing what type of framework they brought, what assumptions they used to make this plan or to endorse this action, this is where I would ask this question. And I may take some notes on what types of things they thought were appropriate to consider so that in later discussion, I'm returning instead to key decision points and analyzing why those occurred and pulling in that evidence that I saw throughout the game that occurred as well. Tony?
And if I can, I had a great experience chatting with Major Innocenti at West Point, and he's incorporated a game in his history of 21st century or 20th century warfare. And he's done it very skillfully, where students spend the time immersed in the game, and he does some regular checks and feedback and assessment along the way. But the learning that he was going after is not necessarily the specifics of that game. It's more of how that battle in World War II connected to the larger war and to post-war relationships. And so he got at that learning objective in the final exam. So just another way to think about how do I know if learning occurred. It might not be in that moment or in that game. The game might be generating that learning, but the way to assess it might be in a different environment.
I think the only other alibi I'd bring in there is that sometimes students can fail in the game and yet learn a great deal. And so often winning the game is not necessarily the evidence of learning. In some cases, it may be that consistent winning is the positive outcome that you're looking for. But in some cases, it may be that there was some sort of deeper lesson or understanding that was achieved. And in some cases, that might mean that the reflection component that occurs after the game is the most important. And you might be able to assess that with a particular survey instrument that you design in order to look at any change, any perceived changes, any outcomes that you expected to to occur. It might be that they write a reflection, or that they write a short guided assignment that looks at, if I could change one thing, or if there was one thing that surprised me within this activity. You'd have to shape your reflection question carefully, which I'm not doing on the fly very well. But you would ask that question about, what was the failure that surprised you, and how can you improve from that? What would you do differently in a subsequent scenario? And hopefully, if you can have multiple events, you would see those lessons drawn in and new mistakes, if any, made in subsequent games. And that's where you can also see this continuous learning that's going to occur across the cycle of games.
And so I think related both to this continuous learning across the cycle, and I'd like to go back to, I think it was your motivation slide. And then some of what you were talking about reminds me of what I would deem gamification, where I would say you can't move to the next level until you've finished all of what you needed to learn or get done in one level. So how much do you think using gamification for motivation would help or hinder when people have to get something before they can move on, or they might be overcome by not being able to, so then give up?
This is interesting. It's a good question. We've in the motivation course I taught, we had a great deal of discussion about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And extrinsic is what you're talking about, right? That you get points, or you get to another level, and you get that feedback like, hey, you're doing well. And that's sort of intended, and it does actually motivate people. You have to be careful with that, because it can change the focus, right? You can, instead of focusing on the learning, you focus on the points, and you focus on the level. So it has to be done judiciously, where an external motivating factor targets something that is, if you can target and reinforce something that's internal, such as, for example, if in a course where people are learning how to do operational planning, the reinforcement might be that they are getting better at operational planning, right? So you're reinforcing a sense of competence, which is not an external reward, right? You're not getting some points, or you're not moving to another level. You're getting this internal reinforcement, and that's powerful. Like I said, the external can work, but it has some important limits and some important considerations. And there's just a lot of research that suggests you can get people to do things. If you give them $1, they'll read a book, and you stop giving them $1, they'll stop reading. And so it won't necessarily have lasting impact. So you have to work the external, but it has to be targeted, if you can, at internal capabilities or internal feelings.
I'd add to that briefly that I think, depending on the type of game, right, this is perhaps you'd have to have something more nuanced in an online atmosphere, but the faculty facilitator plays a really key role in terms of reinterpreting and redirecting game results, which are that instant feedback, in some case, instant gratification, towards learning outcomes. And I think the feedback and the fact that feedback also should focus on that process focus, right? Something that talks about, how can you in the future do better? What are your goals for yourself in terms of doing better, which Tony talked about in terms of micro goals and self goals and ownership. But also, how do we align those with the goals that we're communicating to you for how you could improve in important and observable ways in the subsequent activities or in your future performance. And that in and of itself is meant to be an empowering method of feedback.
Okay, so we have a few more people typing. I don't know if they're typing questions or not, but and we're very close to the end, but I was in a discussion once with another researcher who used a spectrum of learning, and instead of win and lose, if you've won, then what you did worked, so you didn't learn anything. But if you didn't get the outcome, then you learned that something didn't work, and that was an opportunity to pause and learn. So do you think this whole spectrum of lose and win actually kind of takes away from the learning of, were you able to put yourself in a situation where you needed to try something different?
And so I would say yes. And we've heard this, I think, from a lot of people in professional military education, wargaming as well, that there tends to be a detachment when winning occurs, and then either, you know, a blame of the game for those who didn't win, or an assumption that you were right. And in educational wargaming, particularly in a lot of the designs that are being used, the assumption that the plan that worked today is the plan that works tomorrow is not what we're hoping to reinforce with the students. It's that there are complexities and patterns that we need to recognize and then actually reevaluate as we move into the next context. So in some cases, you can play only to the point, you know, not play to the point of winning, or you can shape that feedback and the results through the after action process and through the feedback process and an evaluation that emphasizes the learning more than the winning, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, because you can learn a great deal from failure within these games. And in some cases, that may, in fact, be the point, is to find areas of disconnect or areas of misunderstanding and to be able to correct them in a low-stakes environment.
Okay.
And I'll reinforce what Kate said about that being a really important role for the instructor to shape that. How do you interpret that result?
Excellent. Well, thank you. We're a bit over time, and there's been lots of great discussion as well in the chat room on Discord. So I encourage everyone to go in there and continue this discussion. And Tony and Kate, thank you very much.
Thank you.